Well, welcome everybody. The elders decided that they were going to record these lessons and put them on the web. So we want to welcome you, and I want to welcome anybody else that's going to be looking at the slides as I talk about this morning. So because of that, a lot of people have not heard and been here for the first two lessons. So I just want to kind of go over that and say, whoops, let me go back a second. Okay. Before we go on, I wanted to talk about the last 2 weeks. So we had lessons on what happens when you die. That's what we talked about for the last 2 weeks. And basically we talked about it's a matter of your perspective. If you're in the physical realm, which we are, the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus and all the writers of the Gospels and the epistles all agree that when you die, you go to what they call sleep, a soul sleep. That's what Jesus called. I call it, Jesus said they're sleep. And so from a physical point of view, when people die, their bodies go away, their souls go to a sleeping situation. That's what it's from a physical point of view, from our point of view. But from a spiritual point of view, there is no time. There is no sleep. So when a soul goes to a spiritual realm, there's no past, there is no present, there's no future. There's just it. And so we said possibly, we don't know for sure because the Bible doesn't tell us for sure, that people just, once they leave the physical realm and go to the spiritual realm, then they are one of two places, with Christ, with God, in what we call heaven, or waiting for judgment and going to be going to hell. So anyhow, that's just a brief summary of what we talked about for 2 weeks. So, in a couple sentences, it's hard for me to say that. But as I mentioned at the end of last week, the Bible has a whole lot more to say, and specifically, it talks about different things that we're going to talk about in the next few weeks. And where I want to start with is what Jesus has to say about all this. So we'll get into that in a few weeks about other things, but we're going to look specifically today at what Jesus says in chapter 24 of Matthew. And it's called Revelation of the Last Days. For thousands of years, people have been contemplating, well, what happens? We talked about what happens immediately after your death, but what happens after that? And that's what we're going to look at. Jesus calls it what happens in the last days. So before we get into his actual verses in Matthew, when Jesus speaks, everyone should listen. Excuse me, I need to change my lesson because I have the lesson for next week. I just started. I apologize. So this is what we were doing for the last 2 weeks. And I said, it's a matter of your perspective from the physical realm or from the spiritual realm. And man's total existence is between those two realms. But you're going to experience, you're in the physical realm right now, and you're going to experience the spiritual realm. Okay, now, bring it up to what Matthew has to say, what Jesus has to say in the book of Matthew. The writer of Hebrews says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed their heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. The writer of Hebrews, possibly Paul, said that Jesus and us, we're living in the last days. For thousands of years, people have wondered, well, what's going to happen in the last days? There's a lot of books. There's even movies and all kinds of stuff written about the last days. And so in the next few weeks, we're going to look at what Jesus has to say, and we're going to look at what the Bible has to say in general about all these things that are going to happen in the last days. So specifically, we're going to focus on Jesus. But before we get to his words, Paul had to say this in 2 Timothy. But mark this, there will be troubled times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lover of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Paul says to Timothy, have nothing to do with these people. Doesn't that kind of sound like now?
Sounds like Congress to me.
Well, doesn't that sound like what happened? Yes. What was happening in the Old Testament during the time of the Israelites and the Hebrews, and it's the same characteristics.
As long as Satan is tempting you and influencing this world, that's the way it's going to be.
That's just the human nature. That's just human nature of people that are separated from God.
Paul said that's the way it is in the last days. Okay, this is what I'm trying to get to you. Okay, do you believe the words of Jesus? I do.
Amen.
Yeah. When Jesus speaks, I listen. When the Son of God speaks, everyone should listen. And when God speaks, you'd be fool not to listen. That's Dunk's Bible, by the way. I don't have a red letter Bible. I really need one. Got to listen to the red letters. When Jesus speaks, folks, that's real important.
Why are Bibles printed without red letter today?
Good question. I don't know.
Maybe somebody thinks it's not important.
Okay. So
Publisher.
What I want to do, I want to talk just a little bit about Matthew chapter 23 before we get, I want to set the stage for Matthew 24. Now, Jesus is pronouncing woes on the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He's really coming down hard on them before he talks to his apostles, his disciples. And Jesus tells these leaders, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue you from town to town. Jesus is telling them, he's talking about the disciples. He's talking about people that follow the disciples' teaching. These people, these are Jews, are going to kill and crucify them. This is when he starts his first ministry about 3 years before he is crucified. So Jesus predicts the persecution and killing of the apostles, Stephen, we know from the book of Acts, and many other Christians that are going to be killed in the first century. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah and Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. So within the next 50 years of when Jesus is telling this, let's just say about 32 AD, these things are going to happen within the next 50 years. So Jesus tells the Pharisees and teachers of the law that a retribution is coming with the Jews that are living in this century, in the first century. Retribution. Okay, so Matthew goes on to tell us that Jesus reveals the future to his disciples. And as he's revealing the future to his disciples, he's also revealing to us today. He's going to tell us about it. So in the first two verses of Matthew 24. It says, as Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples, came up to him and called his attention to this building. He said, look at all these wonderful buildings. Do you see all these things? Jesus said, truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. This prophecy was literally fulfilled on April 14th, my birthday, by the way, at AD 70, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. The temple was sacked, burned, and destroyed. And the funny thing is, when they burned, a lot of the gold things and stuff melted and everything after the tremendous heat. And after it all cooled down, people returned to that site and turned over the stones and everything looking for gold. Every stone of that temple was turned over. And that was by prophecy, and it actually happened. Kind of interesting. The destruction of the temple, though, and most of Jerusalem was only the foreshadowing what was going to come. And that's what Jesus was going to talk about. So the rest of the book of chapter 24 of Matthew is called the Olivet Discourse. And it is the name given to the private conversation that Jesus had with the disciples just 3 days before he was crucified. It took place on the Mount of Olives, which is just on the east side of Jerusalem at that point. Still is, still there. So starting with verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will all this happen? He was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, they weren't talking about his coming from death. He was talking about his coming to be king. That's what they were talking about. So Jesus refers to the future events. Some of these events will happen between AD 33 and AD 70. And some of the events that Jesus is talking about are going to happen after AD 70, a long time after AD 70. And we'll read about those. Jesus tells us what will be the signs of Jesus coming and the end, the signs of the end of days. Starting in verse 4. Jesus answered his disciples, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name claiming, I am the Messiah, and I will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nations will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains, he says. So, many bad things will be the sign of the beginning of the end. There will be deceivers and false messiahs, and we're going to look at that in just a second. There will be wars against nations, between nations. There will be famines and earthquakes. These are the beginning of birth pains, Jesus says. Now, have any of these things happened so far?
Of course.
Answer?
Yes. Yeah. Multiple times.
At least to some extent, these things have happened. They're happening right now. So as long as Satan has influence in this world, these things are always going to happen if Satan has his way. Now, famines and earthquakes have happened for a very long time. These are the birth pains. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about false messiahs. Has false messiahs come and go?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let's go back. Let's go back in history.
Dave, what do you think he means by birth pains?
The beginning.
I hate to give you my own idea, but I think this world is going to be destroyed and it's going to be reborn. We talk about, we'll get into that in a few weeks. The new earth, new heaven, and a new earth. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's my,
Or just the birth,
off the top of my head.
the birth of the changes that are coming, maybe.
Yeah, things are going to
Beginning
change.
of the end.
So I want to talk to you about three people, just to give you an idea that false messiahs have always been part of history. Judas, son of Hezekiah, around 4 BC, in the confusion after Herod died, Judas, who was Josephus, historian, calls heads of the robbers. He assaulted the royal palace in the new city, and not far from what was to be Jesus' home in Nazareth, by the way, that new city of Sepphoris. He seized the weapons in the armory there, stole all the money he could find, and terrorized the surrounding countryside. The Romans caught him and killed him and scattered all of his followers. People of the first century knew about this guy. They knew that there were people that they thought were the Messiah at one point. Later on, Simon of Perea came along. Following the death of Herod the Great, he was a large person and a tall and robust body, so they called him king after Herod the king died. He was crowned with a royal diadem and proceeded to burn and plunder a number of royal palaces. Herod's former commander, Gratus, gathered a body of men along with Roman troops, fought a battle against him and his followers, and Simon himself fled from battle but was caught and beheaded. So another person that people thought was the Messiah, Simon of Perea, was caught and beheaded. Another one, after Herod the Great died, his territory was divided between his sons, who ruled on the Romans' behalf of client kings. The tetrarch, Herod Archelaus, proved to be a particularly ineffective ruler. In 6 AD, he was deposed, and Judah was placed under direct Roman rule. A Galilean named Judas and a Pharisee called Zadok stirred up people in reaction to this and began a revolt, which was savagely repressed by the Romans. Josephus again said that over 2,000 people were killed at the time before the campaign was over. Judas the Galilean was actually mentioned by Gamaliel in a speech to the Sanhedrin in Acts 5:37. So this guy was actually mentioned in the Bible, saying that he was killed and his followers were scattered. So throughout ancient history, there were people that claimed to be the Messiah. And throughout modern history, there have been cult leaders that have claimed to be the Messiah. I'm just going to point out a few of them. Some that you're going to know. I don't know if you know Arnold Porter. Between 1804 and 1872, he was referred to himself as Porter Christ, was the leader of the Latter-day Saints. There's a theme, by the way, with the Latter-day Saints. William Davis, also leader of the Latter-day Saints, declared himself to be God the Father, and when his first son he declared to be Jesus Christ. We think that's weird, but these things really happened. Father Divine George Bacon, an African-American spiritual leader, claimed to be God from 1907 to he died in 1965. Louis de Pelboro, a Dutch charismatic leader, claimed to be God as well and Messiah until he died in 1968. Now you've heard of this guy. Sun Myung Moon was a self-proclaimed Messiah. Moon was the leader of the Unification Church. He just died in 2012. Now this next one gets me. Alan John Miller and Mary Luck. They're alive today. They're in Queensland, Austria, and they're part of the Divine Truth movement. Anybody heard about the Divine Truth movement from Australia? He claims to be the Messiah, and she claims to be the reborn Mary Magdalene. I mean, yeah. And they're preaching this stuff today. Okay, well, these are just a few of thousands. There's been thousands of people that claim to be the Messiah or God. And the Bible warns us about people like this, folks. Just a few passages. Matthew 7. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. And John warns us, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Jesus goes on now in verses 9 through 14, talking to his disciples. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. He's talking to them. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. And that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. He keeps talking about what's going to happen before the end comes. So just going over those verses, Christians will be hated and persecuted and martyred. Some Christians will fall away from their faith. Jesus says many false prophets will come to deceive people. There are a bunch of folks out there right now, by the way, claiming to be false prophets. They don't say I'm a false prophet. They claim to be. They claim to be a prophet. But if they don't teach what the Bible teaches, they're false. And wickedness will increase. Wickedness has, well, as David pointed out, we've always had wickedness. It just comes in different forms. But there's plenty of wickedness out there right now, folks. Those who remain faithful will be saved. That's great to know. And the gospel will be preached to all the world. There's a lot of gospel preaching going on out there, and our church is part of helping that happen. And then the end will come. So looking a little bit closer at these, have these things happened? Are these happening? I think that they're happening. These things are happening, at least to some extent. Christians were hated and persecuted and killed in the first centuries. We know about all those horrible stories about what the Roman emperors did to Christians. But today, there are people around the world being killed for their faith, for being Christians. This is just an example. I don't even know what the situation is. I can't tell you. But people are dying today because they're Christians. Some Christians have fallen away. For whatever reason, the world and its things draw people away from Christianity. There are plenty of false teachers out there. We know about Jim Jones. He's gone. And we know about Tammy Faye and Jim Baker. And there's many, many. I just threw those up there to let you know. It seems that there's a lot of evil in this world, and I think it's getting worse. And I'm just going to throw a few nasty pictures at you here. It's all over the world. It's even in the United States, too. This world could use a lot more love. Definitely. And missionaries have gone most part of the world. There's not too many places. Some places where maybe the missionaries are prevented from going. But through most of the world, their missionaries have been, to the most part, have been out there. Okay, so this next section is mostly from church tradition. We'll know a few of the dates, but Jesus told his apostles that you're all going to die. You're all going to be persecuted, and you're all going to die. And so this is a list of what happened to him. Of course, we know Jesus Iscariot took his own life on 33, so I don't know if he's talking about him, but anyhow. Here's James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded by the King Agrippa, 44 AD. Andrew was crucified in Patras, Greece, around 60 AD. James, the son of Alphaeus, was stoned to death in Jerusalem, 62 AD. Thaddeus was killed in Beirut, 65 AD. And in something, Simon the Zealot, 65 AD. Most of these dates and descriptions of what happened are not historical evidence. We don't have historical evidence. They're from writings and things, historic documents that may or may not be true. But I'm just telling you what has been reported. Simon Peter, of course, we know was crucified upside down by Nero in 66 AD, and Paul was beheaded by Nero in 66 AD. Matthew was likely killed in Ethiopia, they say, in 68 AD. Bartholomew was killed on Easter, and we're talking about Iran over that way in about 70 A.D. Thomas was impaled by a spear, they say, in India in 72 A.D. And Philip was crucified upside down by Emperor Domitian in 80 A.D. Matthias was crucified in 80 A.D. And the last to die was John. Now, he was not crucified, killed. He died of natural causes, but of course, he was in the Isle of Patmos. He was exiled there for a while. So he definitely was discriminated against before he died in Ephesus. So what Jesus told his disciples happened to him. So we're going to go on. I'm going to go back now. We're going back to Matthew, where Jesus is talking again to his disciples. We pick it up in verse 15. Things are going to get, now he's switching. He just talked about what's going to happen to them. He said about what's going to happen for the end of times. And now he's telling us exactly what's going to happen to the folks in Judea. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophets Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one in the housetop go down and get anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or in the Sabbath. But then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and it will never be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, for the sake of Christians, those days will be shortened. These are the things that happen. And most of you are aware of these things that Jesus was predicting right there, 37 years before they happened. A leader of the Roman army will be standing in the temple. That leader was Titus. You should flee from Jerusalem and Judea to avoid the coming trouble, Jesus said. Go quickly without taking your belongings. When things happen, they're going to happen real quickly. So get out of their way and get out of Jerusalem. It will be especially horrible for, obviously, women and nursing women. It would take place, hopefully, Jesus says it won't take place on the Sabbath. And why is that? And in the winter, in April. Because that's the time where hundreds of thousands of people come to Jerusalem. There will be catastrophic suffering, never to be equaled in the course of human history. A lot of bad things have happened in human history, but this particular event on April 14th, AD 70 was really bad. But those days will be shortened. Romans will get done with their cruelty in a few days, and some Christians will survive. Now, Jesus himself mentioned the book of Daniel. Now, I have done a complete study of Daniel, and I don't know if we'll ever see that in this class, but I just want to mention one passage that Daniel says. Daniel had these visions, and in one of his visions, this is what it was. After 434 years, the anointed one, Jesus, will be put to death and have no one. Everyone, as we know, when Jesus was arrested, left him. The people of the ruler, which would be Vespasian at that time, who will come, will destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, the temple. The end will come like a flood. War will continue to the end. And have been decreed. The Jewish-Roman War lasted from 66 to 73 AD. So Daniel predicted. Daniel, the book of Daniel was written about 540 BC. The destruction of Jerusalem happened 610 years later, in the first century. It talked about what happened to Jesus. He was crucified. Talked about what happened to the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And Jesus says, he repeats that to his disciples. Now, what Jesus just said and what Daniel said, did that happen? Yeah. It happened exactly the way these people kind of describe, where Jesus described it. The Romans set siege to Jerusalem in 70 AD, and on April 14th, Titus defeated the Zealots and the Sicarii forces. The Zealots and the Sicarii were kind of like the army, the rebels. For not all the people in Jerusalem were army type, killing Roman soldiers and stuff like that. The Romans breached the walls of Jerusalem and then entered the temple. Now, Titus was the son of Vespasian, and so they surrounded the city, and they tried to. Josephus was with Titus. Josephus went to the city and tried to negotiate a truce. He said, if you don't put your arms down and stop killing, what would happen at night and things? Jews, the Sicarii, would come out, secret out, and they would go and grab Roman soldiers that were kind of out by themselves and kill them. And then you'd sneak back into the city. And this was been going on for a couple of months. And so Titus said, that's enough. Okay, we're going to give you one ultimatum. But because Josephus was a Jew at one time, he was captured years ago by the Vespasian and taken to Rome and became part of the court. Josephus was hated by his fellow Jews. So when Josephus goes to Jerusalem to try to negotiate a peace, it didn't happen. They rejected him, almost killed him. So Josephus goes back to Titus and says, I'm sorry, they're not going to give up. And so the next few days, then they stormed Jerusalem, got through the several walls and went into the temple and burnt it completely. So if you've ever been to Rome, just left of the Colosseum is, if you walk through this arch right here of Titus, you go into the Forum. And if you go in there and look on the wall, look on the side of the wall, there's carvings. This carving is on the side of that ark, and it's a description of the Roman soldiers carrying items from the temple out. Kind of interesting. The brother of Titus built this column in his honor. So Josephus went on to report that 1.1 million people were killed during this conflict. And this all happened because the Roman siege occurred during the month of April, which was the time of the Passover. So there were thousands of people that had come from other parts of that area to celebrate the Passover. And they got caught in the middle while they were in Jerusalem. I hate to show you this. So, before we go on, and I will go on because that's right. I didn't realize what time it was going to be when we got done. Okay. So, well, maybe we could talk about what we talked about today, or if you have any questions about what we talked about last week before we go on to the rest of chapter 24. Because Jesus is getting ready to tell us about the future, not just what happened in 37 years after his death, but Jesus is going to tell us about what's going to happen further down the road. And that's the beginning of the series of lessons that we're going to look at in the next few weeks. So I'm going to teach next week about what Jesus has to say in this chapter. And then I'm going to take a 2-week break, and I'm going to come back and then we're going to talk about the second coming of Jesus. What's going to happen when Jesus comes back? What's going to happen after that? What's going to happen at the final judgment? We're going to look at all that stuff. There'll be terms like the period of tribulation. You may have heard about it, you may have not heard about it. There are terms like the millennium, 1,000 years. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about not what I think or what a bunch of theologians say about it. We're going to look at what the Bible says about it. That's why I put all these lessons together, because I hear what other people say and I read what other people say in this world, and that's great, and I appreciate their knowledge, but I want to know what the writers of this Bible, who were inspired writers of God, said about these issues. So the bell's going to ring in about 2 minutes. So does anybody have any comments or questions before we go on? Because Jesus he does switch gears here in the middle of chapter 24, and I don't want to get into that yet. All right. We had a lot of questions last week about what happens when you die. Yeah, great.
Of course, there are a lot of opinions about Matthew 24. We interviewed a preacher years ago for a job here, and his view, which I wasn't aware that this was a view that a lot of people held, was that AD 70 is when everything happened and Jesus actually returned. And we're living in the age after
Jesus returned.
Yeah, so I don't know, you know.
You'd think Josephus would have told us about that.
Yeah.
He was there while all this was going on.
Well, I've read some of their stuff, and I said, well, I can see where they get this, but it doesn't fit some other things.
Yeah.
One of the commentators I read this week was that the abomination of desolation, this is a fine point, it really doesn't matter, but he said the temple was destroyed before the Roman army actually got to it. Because they tore down the walls, and the temple was set afire
by the Jews.
And that's what his, I don't know what he bases it on, some historical stuff. So he thinks the abomination of desolation is something other than the Romans entering the temple.
Well, that there was more abominations going on. And I can tell you about those at different points in time. The Romans had control of Jerusalem and the temple. In some cases, they actually controlled what went on in there, and there was some cases where they actually brought in a pig and sacrificed a pig on the altar. This was, I think, around 66 BC, where some bad things happened. And then between the time Jesus died and there were some other things that went on in the temple that weren't exactly supposed to be good too. But yes, in history, there were several bad things that happened in the temple, not just this particular time. But because of Jesus' reference to Daniel, and when you put what Daniel had to say with what Jesus has to say, it kind of all fits together in the period when the Romans were sieging the town Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. That's pretty much historical fact what happened there. And then, by the way, what happened after that, the next year or so, there was one group of people that left Jerusalem and went to Masada. You probably know that story. Went up on top of Masada, and we got 5 more minutes. I'll just Masada. Herod the Great built a retreat on the hill of Masada, about 7 miles from the Dead Sea, directly east from Jerusalem. and they had this real cool palace up there, and real cool up there. And so the Roman soldiers were over there. There was about 100 of them that would come over there and keep the place up to speed. So if any of the leaders of the Roman army or the people that were head of Pilate or anything like that wanted to go over there and relax and take a vacation, they could go to Masada. Well, when Jerusalem got surrounded and was in trouble, Sicarii forces left Jerusalem and went over to Masada and secretly went up there and killed all the Roman soldiers. And the Sicarii and their families went over there and started living over there, and were over there about 2 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. But then when Vesavius, the emperor, found out about it, he sent legions over there. They built a ramp up to Masada to get these Sicarii people, and that would be the end of the conflict between Rome and the Jews. Well, it turned out the people of Masada decided to kill themselves. And I'm telling you off the top of my head, I don't remember how many hundreds of people killed themselves. There were 2 women and 3 children, we understand, that hid and survived the suicide and were captured by the Romans and told the story about what had happened up there. But that was the end of the Roman Jewish war in 73 AD. So anyhow, yeah.
Some of us here have been to Masada, and it's hundreds of feet.
Oh, it's way up there.
It's huge plateau. And
It's huge.
when the Essenes or whoever they were that took it over, killed the Romans,
Sicarii, yeah.
the Roman army came in, they couldn't get up there. They built we all heard of siege ramps.
Yeah.
They built that thing by hand out of rocks, and it's like half a mile long.
It's still there.
It's still there.
It goes up the side of the mountain.
It's crazy how much labor that must have taken.
Well, they were there a couple of years building this ramp. So anyhow, I didn't plan on telling you all that, but I had some time and I didn't want to start that, so I thought I'd fill you in on that. So anyhow, but Jesus predicted what was going to happen in Jerusalem. And the funny thing, of course, Daniel's visions predicted what was going to happen 610 years ago. So we got 2 minutes, but I think I have the privilege of letting you go right now.